The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Jen Saunders. I'm a Senior Program Officer with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar series on rapid rehousing. We're so delighted to have our speakers today talking about rapid rehousing as a system-wide response to ending homelessness. Just some brief logistical information about the webinar before we begin. All the lines are on mute with the exception of speakers. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar in the question box you'll see off on the right. We've had almost 950 people register for today's webinar, so we're not likely to get through all of the questions, but we hope to compile the questions that we're not able to get to and release a follow-up document summarizing these responses. And we'll be posting the audio and slides immediately following the webinar on our website, endhomelessness.org. Let me just start out by telling you about our work. The National Alliance to End Homelessness is a national organization committed to preventing and ending homelessness in the U.S. At the Alliance, we identify policy solutions and promote them to the administration and to Congress and anyone who will listen. We have a capacity building team that goes to communities to help them create systems, and we provide data and information to educate opinion leaders about homelessness and housing as a solution. And most importantly, we learn from providers in the field about what is working and what is not working in order to inform our work. Before we begin, we wanted to find out a little bit more about how you learned about this webinar. So I'm going to launch a poll. If you could take a moment to complete that, that would be very helpful. Thanks so much. That's very helpful for our information. It sounds like most people learned about the webinar through our email. And we have a newsletter that goes out that you can sign up for at endhomelessness.org. So please do sign up for that if you're not already. So moving on. I wanted to give a very brief overview of what rapid rehousing is. Most of you are already familiar with the intervention, but to recap, rapid rehousing is an intervention designed to help individuals and families quickly exit homelessness and return to permanent housing. It's offered without preconditions, and the resources and services provided are typically tailored to the unique needs of the household. The core components of rapid rehousing include housing identification, rent and move-in assistance, and case management and services. And while a rapid rehousing program must have all three core components, it's not required that a program provide all three services, nor that a household utilize them all. I just wanted to quickly mention that in September, the Alliance, with the support of the Melville Charitable Trust, convened nearly 100 rapid rehousing champions from around the country to develop a common vision about how we can advance rapid rehousing. And what we really learned is that rapid rehousing continues to be the primary solution for ending homelessness. It effectively gets households into permanent housing and keeps them there. And ramping up rapid rehousing across the country would mean that we could serve more people, reducing the overall number of homeless people in the country. And while we know rapid rehousing is increases around the country, there's a need to scale up the intervention in a coordinated manner and at the systems level in order to address homelessness on a broader scale. And we'll learn more about that today from our speakers. Before we get started, we also would like to know who is participating today. So I'm going to launch another quick poll, and if you could take a moment and complete that, that would be very helpful. So thanks to all of you for completing the poll. It sounds like we have about 33% of the people participating who are COC lead or system leaders, about 40% of providers, 15% funders, public or private agencies, and 14 other. So moving along. And I apologize, I did have a slide in there that introduced our wonderful speakers today, so let me quickly go over that before I turn it over to Katharine. So we'll hear from Katharine Gale of Katharine Gale Consulting and Focus Strategies. Katharine will provide an overview of what it means to build an effective homeless system around rapid rehousing. And we'll also hear from Nichele Carver of the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, who will talk about their experience in Virginia, including how they scaled up rapid rehousing and the impact it has had at the systems level. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katharine.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Can everybody hear me?
I hear you great.
Okay, great. So why don't we go to the first slide here. So I think, as Jen said in her introduction about what rapid rehousing is, that probably most of the folks on the phone are quite familiar with rapid rehousing as a program model. So I'm really going to focus my remarks on implementing it within a system framework. I think a lot of people think about rapid rehousing as a program with the core components that Jen described, and of course there are rapid rehousing programs and rapid rehousing funding sources. But really it's more than a program. It's a strategy for helping as many people as we can end their homelessness as quickly as possible. And it's also really the core goal of every homeless crisis response system. That is, our joint work is really intended to rehouse all the people that we have in our community who are homeless rapidly. And so in an effective system, we've designed not only our models and programs around that, but the whole system has really been aligned around this central goal. And the programs are coordinated to achieve the goal of rehousing people rapidly, whether they're formally in a rapid rehousing program or not. Next slide. So I use the word system, and I always like to start by talking about what do we mean by system. I think we throw this word around a lot. We're familiar with it in a lot of settings, not just in ending homelessness. And really, in the simplest terms, a system brings together many parts. They're not all doing the same thing. They have different roles, different responsibilities, but they're working together within a defined set of resources and practices. So a system knows where its boundaries are, what resources it has to work with, and what its primary methods or practices are. And those things are aligned and working together toward a common goal. In our case, that common goal is ending homelessness. And in a strong system, everyone knows the function of each part, how their work relates to the other parts, and how the whole system is performing on achieving the goal, and what their contribution is to that performance. Next slide. So the system we work in is the homeless system, or as I prefer to call it, the crisis response system. That wording comes out of the Opening Doors plan, and it really helps us to understand that the purpose of our system is to respond to the crisis of homelessness. Its goal is to end people's homelessness quickly and with a high level of confidence that they won't return to our system, or as many communities have now adopted as their motto, to make homelessness brief, rare, and one time. So in this graphic, From Funders Together to End Homelessness, we see there are several parts to the system, and we see how they relate to each other in this kind of simplified drawing where people enter, where people get certain resources, and how people move from one part of the system to another. The paths are clear. And I'm going to return to this idea of a graphical design of your system in a second. Within the system, the relationships between the components have to be developed and understood. The picture is a simplification, and we need to have mapped it out more specifically and know how each player relates and what their relationship to the other parts are. Next slide. So I want to talk about how we build an effective crisis response system that centers around rapid rehousing. Not that it's its only component, right? Our system has many different pieces working together. But when the primary goal of the overall system is rehousing people rapidly, then the strategies, the tools, and the resources for rapid rehousing have to play a primary part. So we've come up with kind of 5 essential steps to building that kind of crisis response system. First, the system pieces need to be aligned to the goal, rehousing people rapidly. Secondly, and related, the resources of the system need to reflect that alignment and that level of priority. We can't have a system that says it prioritizes rehousing people rapidly that has a 6-month wait to get that assistance. Thirdly, the system needs to make partnerships within the system and outside it to keep the focus on rehousing people rapidly successful. If our system, the homeless crisis response system, is going to focus on rehousing people rapidly, then we're going to need partners who focus on their other needs, employment, healthcare, childcare, whatever those may be, and we'll talk a little more about that. The fourth is that we need to develop a system approach to progressive engagement. I'm going to define that term a little bit later, but it's basically a way to allow us to try rapid rehousing with more household types and to feel secure about that because we've arranged for the resources we need in case we're not successful. And finally, the system needs to ensure it's not screening households out from the opportunity to be rehoused. If we have something else to offer people first, that's great, but we don't want to close the possibility of being rehoused rapidly to some households if it means they linger in prolonged homelessness. And I'll talk more about that too. So let's go through these 5 in more detail. Next slide. So first I mentioned alignment. So what does that mean? Well, it means that each part of the system, so in most of our systems that's going to be coordinated entry, shelters or crisis housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, maybe other types of subsidized housing. They know their role in the system and how they relate to the other parts. No one's doing this work alone when it takes more than one piece, and the onus isn't on the family or the individual who needs our help to get those pieces to work together. So a family that's in shelter and is going to move out with the help of rapid rehousing shouldn't have to navigate that relationship. It's up to those components to know how they work together, to have laid that out in the way that their system functions, and to make sure that that's working. So to do that, it's really important to have clear standards, written standards that say what each program type is and what it means. Rapid rehousing in our community means this, and whether you're served by Program A or Program B, you can expect certain kinds of supports and outcomes. The Alliance has issued rapid rehousing program standards, and they're a great place to start. I'd say many communities that I've worked with have developed some written standards because it's a requirement for continuums of care, but often they just restate what the funding sources allow, sort of what's permissible, and that's really not enough. You need to go through the work of determining what a high-functioning program means in terms of the supports it offers, the time it spends, even the costs that you're willing to see, how much you're willing to invest to get those outcomes. Not that every program is necessarily identical, but when there's a difference, there's a reason for that. So for example, if a type of program that's serving youth is expected to have slightly longer stays from other programs because we know it takes a little longer for certain youth to be successful, then you've had that conversation and that's mapped out in your written standards. You also need to go through the work of defining how the components relate to each other, and also how if one program or approach isn't working, the system ensures that another one is tried. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Key to these standards and expectations should be outcomes. What's the component expected to deliver, and how will you know if it's successful? For rapid rehousing, key performance measures have to do with the rates of exits to permanent housing, the time it takes to get housed, and what a reasonable expectation of returns to the system is. You need to set that, and you need to track it at the program level as well as at the component level. And again, the Alliance has performance standards you can use for this. Next slide. Rapid rehousing, next slide, Jen, as we've talked about, is really a core piece of this system response. If you haven't mapped out how your local system looks and shows how and when people receive the resources, I strongly recommend you do that. So in this picture, adapted from the USICH Family Connections document, we see everyone enters through coordinated entry, and those who can be successfully and safely diverted are. The diagram assumes that that's going to be roughly a quarter of the people who come in. So it's making some not only assumptions about the flow and what the role of each intervention is, but roughly some things about how many and the size that we expect it to be. So in this picture, people who can't be diverted are entered into shelter where they get some stabilization services and housing search support right from the get-go. Some households then are expected to be able to exit on their own. You can look at your own data and see how many typically do that, leave for housing on their own within 7 to 10 days. Usually it's quite a lot. So those folks don't need a rapid rehousing program. But anyone who's in shelter much longer than that probably needs some assistance to get out. And in this diagram, we see many households are going to get that assistance by getting into rapid rehousing and links to services. Your community can use this diagram to think through the size and relationship of the pieces in the map to flow. Your picture might look somewhat different, but if your system's really focused on rehousing people rapidly, then rapid rehousing will feature prominently in your system design. Next slide. Of course, to make that design work, there has to be enough resources to provide that rapid rehousing support to the households that don't quickly resolve. I think at this point there's no question that scaling up rapid rehousing is a key feature of the communities that have had the greatest success in reducing homelessness. So Houston, Virginia, Salt Lake City, Mercer County, New Jersey, these places have made an emphasis on rapid rehousing and they've seen significant impacts from it. Los Angeles most recently has reduced family homelessness by about 18% just by making rapid rehousing a core strategy of their family system and really allocating resources to it to make it a larger component of the system. And we're going to hear from Nichele about Virginia in a moment. So where are the resources for this going to come from? Well, of course, you're pursuing every new resource you can. You're advocating for the creation of new rapid rehousing resources at all levels in your state and your locality. But the greatest resource your community is likely to have is really the resources that you already have. So as you think about scaling, you need to think about where you have gaps, which populations right now don't get any support, and you need to think about how you can fund that. Maybe you have to move some resources from places where they're not being as impactful. Maybe you need to move some resources to the programs that have the greatest success so that you can serve more people. I know many of you are already making those kinds of changes, for example, in the reallocation of transitional housing to rapid rehousing in the HUD competition. But you have lots of other resources in your system, or potentially in your system, that could be used for rapid rehousing. And both the Alliance and USICH have put out documents about this that go through a variety of different resources that can be used for rapid rehousing. And I urge you to take a look at those and think about whether you're maximizing them. Next slide.
Thanks, Catherine. So we also wanted to learn from you all about whether or not your community is making an effort to scale up or reallocate resources to rapid rehousing. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if you could take a moment to complete it, that'd be really helpful. Well, thank you. Looks like about 25% of you are making significant changes to scale up to rapid rehousing. About 41% are making some changes. 13% are planning to make changes. 7% are not scaling up, and 14% are not sure. And with that, I will turn it back to Catherine. Oh, I'm sorry, one more poll. So we also wanted to learn about what percent of your system's resources are currently focused on rapid rehousing. So I'll launch one more poll. Thank you again. It looks like 22% of you have more than 30%, 14% more than 20%, 12% more than 10%, 12% less than 10%, and 40% are not sure. So with that, I will turn it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm not surprised, but it seems like the largest group really weren't sure. and then others are sort of in between. So I want to say it's really important to understand if you're really moving to scale, and if you're committed to moving to scale, and many of you, 66%, said you're making changes toward that, to also really understand how you're investing, because you can't have a system dedicated to rehousing people rapidly and not make it a significant part of your investment explicitly for that purpose. Because without those resources, the system gets stuck. Rapid rehousing is the primary thing that creates flow in the system that none of our other strategies really do. It helps to get people out of shelter and off the streets quickly and move people through the system. So I really urge you to really think about understanding how you're investing on that. But also, as you grow your rapid rehousing, it's important to think about how you grow it. Scale is important to making sure you're using the resources efficiently. A lot of places I've seen are adding rapid rehousing, but kind of in dribs and drabs, 5 slots to this agency and 10 to that one. And good rapid rehousing really requires training and skills, and it requires relationships in the community with landlords and with other programs. The Alliance has done a number of webinars and has documents about this and how to be a good rapid rehousing program, so I'm not going to focus on that. But the point is that it's something that agencies really need to specialize in so they can build those relationships, be able to help with housing search, and manage the time-limited assistance efficiently. Having every program in a community competing for the same landlords can create confusion, and too many small programs also really complicates the coordinated entry process. And frankly, not all programs do a great job of doing rapid rehousing. So I really urge you to invest in the capacity of your system by allocating your rapid rehousing resources to strong performers that specialize in this. I also want to say that we're confronting very high-cost markets in much of the country right now, and I hear people say that, therefore, they think rapid rehousing can't be successful. It can, and it is being successful even in very high-cost markets, but it's really hard work. And in those communities, the scale and the relationships are even more important. Having one or a few agencies that really specialize in this, I think, is emerging as a key feature of making rapid rehousing most successful in our tightest markets. Next slide. So if we're going to have some of our agencies really specialize in rapid rehousing, then we're going to need partners. Within the crisis response system, shelters and rapid rehousing are natural partners. Our program standards that I talked about before should clearly capture the role of each. So maybe we say shelters are intended to be safe places for people to stay temporarily while they work to regain housing. Shelters will help some to do that immediately, but they'll need to partner with rapid rehousing programs for others. And what the shelter does and what the rapid rehousing program does should be clear, again, so that we're efficient, but also so we don't lay the burden of coordination onto the client. But really, neither the shelter nor the rapid rehousing program can or should do everything. Some people will be successful in rapid rehousing with just the assistance of that program, but a lot of people may need other supports in the community. Job training and placement, child care resources, connections to health care, a whole variety of services that really any household moving back into housing might need. We don't have to provide that within our programs. For one thing, we don't have the resources to do that because that would take away from rehousing more people. But also, frankly, we're not the experts. Programs and funding sources exist to provide these services to clients just like ours, and we have to work with them to do that. And let me also say this is really a system responsibility. It's not just about rapid rehousing program A reaching out to employment program B. It's about our system leaders reaching out to the system leaders for those services and building the links at the system level. It's not easy, but it's really necessary, and I hope we'll talk more about that when Nichele presents. Next slide. Okay, so we're talking about making sure we can try rapid rehousing with lots of households. So first of all, people will often say to me, well, you can't try it with everybody because that's setting people up for failure, and that makes people worse off. So first of all, we know rapid rehousing works very well for lots of folks, and we shouldn't be afraid of trying it because when we do, we're really setting them up to succeed most of the time. But we also know it won't always work for everyone, and frankly, we're not great at the front end of determining who it's going to work for and who it won't. So rather than screening people out, we should build our systems to give people the opportunity and then reserve some of our resources to provide that something deeper when and if what we're trying isn't working. So this is often called progressive engagement, beginning with a light touch, offering only more when the need arises, and having in place a kind of backstop if it really isn't working out. I think a lot of places say we do progressive engagement because they do periodic reassessments within rapid rehousing programs before continuing support. And that's great. It's really important, and it's part of having a strong rapid rehousing program. But the strongest progressive engagement is really at the system level and involves multiple resources. So deep resources like vouchers and permanent supportive housing are able to step in when rapid rehousing has been tried and it's not enough. So we may give out some of our permanent supportive housing or our vouchers to people right off the bat, say through coordinated entry or shelter, who we can see have been in our system multiple times or have extremely deep needs, and that's who we want these resources to go to. But we also want to keep some of that in our back pocket so we can offer it when we've tried the lighter touch approach. That lets us try rapid rehousing with more households and provide the deeper resources when they're needed, not just based on our guesses or assumptions. Because every program I've worked with has had the surprise of the person they never thought it could work for transforming once housed, and also the one they were sure it would work for needing more support. So we build that understanding into how our system works. Next slide.
Thanks, Katharine. So we're very interested in learning whether communities are implementing a system-wide progressive engagement, so I'm going to launch another poll. If you could complete that, that would be very helpful. Well, thank you again. It looks as though 26% are implementing system-wide progressive engagement, 14% are not, 40% are working on it, and 20% are not sure. And with that, I'll turn it back to Katharine.
Well, that's great, and that's great news that nearly a quarter really has it already in place, so fantastic. I hope we learn more from you and how you're doing it. We know it's not easy to make all of those things align, but it's really important. The other piece that's really important and is related is when you've made that commitment to having a system that works on this, you need to make sure that you're not screening people out from the opportunity to be rehoused rapidly, that the way in which we're implementing prioritization and coordinated entry doesn't preclude people from getting assistance and prolong their homelessness. So it's fine if we have resources for people who present with the highest needs to offer them those. And then we don't need to rapidly rehouse them because we've got something else to offer. But if we don't have enough, then we need to go with what we have to house people now. Too many systems that I've seen prioritize people for interventions that they don't have, and then they're just waiting. They're using methods that put people into buckets, and then they're getting nothing because the bucket that they got screened into is empty right now. The steps I described previously are intended to make it so that your system can offer rapid rehousing to anyone who can't self-resolve quickly and who doesn't immediately get connected to another resource. Next slide. And my screen went blank, Jen, so are we on the next slide?
Yes. Hopefully.
Okay. So, yep. So to conclude, we really need to align our programs around this common goal of rehousing people rapidly. We need to expand, including reallocating and investing our resources to take it to scale. We need to create the mechanisms that let us try this approach with more people and have the responses there that make it work, including progressive engagement. And we need to know how we're doing, not once a year, but all the time. Our system needs to know what we're achieving and where the most impact is coming from, and really reward those strong performers and build that capacity. I think we owe it to the people we serve to give them the best chance of success possible, which means putting our money into the players that have shown they can do it. Those of you who are on the call who are continuum leaders, system leaders, funders, You need to be advocates and leaders for rapid rehousing specifically. It's not just a small piece of your job, it's really key to you being successful, building the system that rehouses people rapidly. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Jen, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. Nichele, are you able to see the screen?
I am.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn it over to Nichele Carver of the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. But before she starts, I just wanted to mention Katharine has talked a bit about the rapid rehousing performance benchmarks and program standards, and those are saved in the handout section of the webinar in case you're interested. So I'll turn it over to you, Nichele.
All right, thank you. So I wish I could tell you that this was an easy transition for Virginia, but that would be a lie. We went through a whole lot of iterations to get to a place where we feel really good about what we're doing. And to be honest with you, at one time, our funding was not keeping up with the trends. So back, and if everybody remembers, homeless prevention and rapid rehousing, HPRP, that was kind of new for a lot of people. And at the same time, simultaneously, we had 4 agencies that were doing a form of rapid rehousing. They called it transition in place. And to be honest with you, our homeless funding was not structured for such forward thinking. We weren't ready. We saw those applications and we were like, what is this? And we had to figure out, because it seemed really good. They were housing people. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't stifling innovation. And so we created a pilot, and we like to create pilots when we're not sure what's going to happen, just to see. And so that was our first shot, and that was called our pilot program. And those had some pretty positive permanent housing outcomes. So the next year we created VP3 because we love acronyms. So the Virginia Promise and Practices Program. And what we did was we carved out some of the homeless money for that VP3, that grant. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about how we got to a place where we were able to kind of realign some of this funding and move the funding around. We made really small shifts in the beginning. I'm talking 2009, 2010, 11, but they were shifts nonetheless. So this was the beginning of us making the movement to rapid rehousing being kind of the program, or the, I think, system that made sure that people were housed quickly. Next slide. So we were lucky enough that the stars aligned, to be honest with you. We had leadership from the governor's level that set up the housing policy framework, and that included 5 strategies, one of them being to increase the flexibility of funding to prevent homelessness and support rapid rehousing for individuals and families. So remember when I talked about VP3, you know, we were able to move some of that money that had strictly been for shelter programs into a program that focused on housing, on permanent housing. And at the same time, while that was going on, where we had the policies lining up, we had a partnership with the Freddie Mac Foundation and the Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness, and their name is now Virginia Housing Alliance, along with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And we had a 3-year project that focused on training, collaboration. It had a system design clinics, we had challenges, and it even sparked many challenges that they still have today. All of those items kind of sparked the belief in everyone, including us here at Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, that we could do this, not as small systems, but we could take this statewide. I mean, we really believed that we could do it. And that makes it easy when you believe in what you're doing and you can talk about it because you feel so strongly about it. Next slide. Oh, and I'm sorry, going back one more time. That slide was created by Homeward, and it was updated by the National Alliance. I want to make sure I give props to those who create stuff for us. Next slide, sorry. And so I'm a huge Star Wars fan, huge. And so I think Yoda is the best to talk about communication. We spent a lot of time talking. We did not make any decisions, changes, anything haphazardly. In fact, Kathy Robertson, our associate director, always talked about this is a big ship that we're turning. It's going to take a while. She would always say that when we felt like maybe this is moving slowly, but we spent a lot of time communicating with our partners. We had input sessions, implementation sessions, surveys. We provided technical assistance. We went to continuum of care and balanced the state local planning group meetings to help communities understand what rapid rehousing was, like what is the purpose of it. And then we spoke to board of directors, because sometimes agencies can't make changes if the board of directors doesn't agree or doesn't understand. And we wanted people to be aware of the changes, to understand them, and to also get that it wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't going to change. It wasn't going to go away. This all happened simultaneously with those trainings and those policy changes. So we were in a state of flux for a long time, really trying to get everybody on board. Next slide, please. So we had a system transformation, and the partnerships through the Freddie Mac grant allowed us to focus our energies on really completely changing how we do business here in Virginia. Our funding changed, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. And then we also just changed how we practice, how are we as agencies and organizations throughout the state, how are we serving people who are experiencing homelessness? How do we look at them? What do we expect? And it changed our thinking. How people did business in the past was no longer adequate. Silos had to go because the resources needed to be maximized for all the people in need in each community. And we really started always talking about housing focus. It wasn't about beds and temporary shelter, but how can we ultimately get people housed, and how do we shape crisis response systems throughout the Commonwealth to make sure that housing was a reality for everyone. So again, it came from, we really looked at it as we were the leaders, we're the decision makers, we're the ones who have to help shape this conversation around the Commonwealth. Next slide. And so I put this graphic here because we heard a lot of times that this was just the pendulum swinging in a different direction, and it was a trend or a fad, and it was going to go away. And we heard that a lot. And so we had to remind organizations and the staff at those organizations and the leaders and communities that the messaging was really clear. Rapid rehousing is not going away. We are in the business of getting people permanently housed. That is our role. That is your role if you're in the homeless service system. And we believe in this approach and had the data to drive our belief system. As leaders, we understood the responsibility we had to move our government agencies, our nonprofits, everybody around Virginia. We had to get them on board and move them along. We took that responsibility very seriously. And again, the 7 of us were very passionate about what we were doing. So when we talked to people, it wasn't kind of, oh yeah, this is what the feds are making us do. We felt so strongly that this was the thing that was going to happen to get people housed, that when we went out and talked about it, I mean, y'all can't see my hands moving, but they're all over the place. We felt so good about what we were doing that we wanted to make sure everybody felt that it caught fire and people wanted to get folks housed. Next slide. So we have something called the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, VHSP, another acronym. And what we did was when we started having these thoughts about how are we going to move everything forward, we decided to put our state and federal homeless funding on the same page, put it all together. We stopped having all these little silos where each agency could apply for funding, and we said communities, a whole community submits one proposal to tell us about the crisis response system in their community. So we have 15 continuum of care and 12 balanced the state local planning groups in Virginia. So we received 27 community-based applications, and we required that those applications have the full crisis response spectrum represented. So, coordinated entry, how they even get into the system had to be discussed. But then your prevention program had to have evidence of diversion. The shelter, we expected low barrier shelters. and that there was a goal of getting people housed quickly as possible. And then rapid rehousing had to have all three components. It needed to be a key strategy, but it had to have housing location, financial assistance, and housing stabilization. And again, every person doesn't need all three pieces, but your system had to have all three pieces available. And we had conversations when communities, put forth applications that were missing some of these key components and had to say, hey, we really don't want you to not receive funding. So how do we help you to figure out how to make this happen? Because we need these key components to be a part of every single system. And some of those conversations were not comfortable, but they had to happen because the expectation was that folks are going to get housed. We were no longer in the business of just sheltering people, but housing people. And we got data to back up our results. Next slide, please. So since we shifted from the strictly shelter-based system to an approach that included rapid rehousing, we started seeing significant decreases. From 2010 to 2016, we had an overall homelessness decrease by 31%. Family homelessness decreased by 37.6%, and homelessness among veterans decreased by 44.6% since 2011. And I'll go ahead and say the plug that Virginia was the first state to functionally end veterans homelessness, because I like to say that a lot. But we have data. So we made all these changes, but we also have data to back up why those changes made sense. So when you start to hear people say it's not going to work, it's not for us, we're different, trust me when I say Virginia felt like every community thought they were special and different and it wasn't going to work when we first started talking about it. And then you fast forward and we're seeing changes in all of the communities, even small changes, but we're seeing changes. Next slide. Our point in time count, again, showed a 31% decrease from 2010 to 2016. And as you can see, we went from 9,080, and just so you know, we know communities have a whole lot more homeless people and a whole lot less, but when you look at it and you look at what we did, that's still dramatic, a 31% decrease. There's no way to say this doesn't work when you look at numbers like this. Next slide. And for families, we had a 37.6% decrease. Nobody's going to argue that it's bad that families are no longer homeless. This is good. These numbers help to tell your story and to help you understand why it's important to focus on housing. All right, next slide. So we don't just say, we've done it, we're good, we're Virginia, good, we're done. We have to stay on track. We have to keep paying attention to this, because what we learned early on is if you stay stagnant, you will fall behind and then have to do all kinds of things to catch back up. What we do to stay on track, we have an annual application renewal cycle for VHSP. And so every year we have people tell us what their community is doing, and we go through asking a lot of questions to see if they're still moving forward. We provide on-site technical assistance and monitoring. We hold quarterly conversations. So our communities, those 27 communities, can expect to hear from us or see us at least 4 times a year to have conversations about what's going on in their community. And then we review expenditures and look at HMIS reporting. So we want to make sure that the money is being spent on housing people, but also the numbers are showing that people are being housed. Next slide. All right, so I'm sorry, it's a poll.
Sorry, Nichele.
That's
So yeah,
okay.
we wanted to hear from communities out there if they are implementing some of the strategies that Nichele just described. So I'm going to launch a poll, and it should be up now. Okay, great. It looks like the majority of you are implementing more than one of these strategies, 70%. So that's good news. Back to you, Nichele.
All right. So when we have our annual application and renewal, we're looking at, how does their system align with the state and federal homeless goals? We look at resource allocation. Are difficult conversations happening? Are we seeing any changes in their numbers and the homelessness in their community? And what does their coordinated entry system look like? We found that communities that really bought into rapid rehousing and adopted the strategies and approach saw significant decreases, while the communities that kind of made changes on paper but still had some outdated philosophies and doctrines didn't see a whole lot of change. In fact, they saw some increases. So early on, we started addressing those. When we saw that, point time count numbers were staying stagnant, we put more resources. We spent more time helping those communities. We were able to decipher some of the code that was going on. So people, again, would say one thing, but the numbers weren't showing it. And so we rewarded the communities that were housing folks. And in our last round of funding, some agencies or some communities lost funding while others gained funding, because, again, we want to put the resources into people being housed and into the communities that are housing people and have made this a primary focus. Next slide. And we were looking for low, no barrier, to your system. How efficient is your system? It's not very efficient if people can't get in it. And so are there barriers to getting into your shelter or rapid rehousing? Are households being screened out? We looked at those sorts of things through our application and through our visits. That's part of what we do on an ongoing basis. The only requirement for rapid rehousing should be homelessness. And we say that all the time when people say, can I help this family? And they start talking and I'll say, are they homeless? And then that's kind of how easy it is. If they're homeless, then that opens the door for rapid rehousing instead of putting all these barriers in place that make people remain homeless. They stay homeless when you have a barrier that keeps them from getting into your system to get permanently housed. Next slide. And when we provide on-site technical assistance and those monitoring visits, we as an agency, and the Homeless and Special Needs Housing Unit specifically, really want to cultivate relationships and cultivate our partnerships. We have to ensure guidelines are being followed. We understand that part, but more, we want to ensure they're being followed so people are being housed. It's not so we can ding people if they're not, it's to make sure people are being housed. We are not interested in shutting organizations down, but how can we work towards the goal of preventing and ending homelessness? We don't want to see families in communities homeless and agencies closing. That's not our goal. And so what do we need to do as an agency to go out, as a state organization to go out and help? And that's what our focus is. Next slide. During the quarterly conversations, we spent a good amount of time just talking to our community, continuum of care and local planning groups to find out, are they using their data to make decisions? When they're seeing a lot of people come in their system, are they then trying to make sure they can prevent them from getting in the system by diverting them? So we really have those conversations about what are you doing with the data you have? And then we look at expenditure rates, because again, we do not want to leave money in one community if another community needs it and has the data to back up why they need it. And then we look at community trends, and that helps to make decisions statewide if we're starting to see trends that we may not have known about, thought about before, so that we can put it in our next application and start to really work on how to fix it. Next slide. And then we compare the expenditures, like I said, to who was served, and we look at our quarterly reports and our expenditure rates, and if we see that a lot of money is being spent but not a lot of people are being housed, then that's the conversation. We got to call and find out what's going on. Or if they're not spending money, why aren't you? Do you not have any more homeless people? You know, and so we make sure we're monitoring the trends across the Commonwealth, and we stay on top of this. We do not rest on our laurels and say we're all good. We try to make sure that we're staying in the know to try to get people housed as quickly as possible. Again, we look at this as a partnership, and we have a responsibility to the people experiencing homelessness in Virginia to try to solve any problems before they get too big and we can't. Next slide. And I just want to end on the note that the individuals and families that we serve each day and that our communities are serving, they don't care about all the struggles and strife that we went through to get to this point. They don't care about the growing pains or the funding. All they care about is where they're going to sleep tonight and when do they get some keys so they don't have to continue to wonder where they're going to sleep. And if your system can change, if you can build a crisis response system to answer those questions for folks so that they're not in a constant state of being unsure of what their future is going to hold. And if you're working on making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurrent, as Katharine said, you're on your way to ending homelessness in your community and your states. And it's kind of the reason why we're all doing this, is to try to make people feel better about those two questions. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Nichele. So we have a lot of questions and not so much time, so I will quickly ask a few. And again, if you've submitted questions, please feel free to keep doing that, and we'll be keeping track and trying to respond to those. So let's start off with Nichele. One of the questions that has come in is, do you do an unsheltered count, and is that taken into account when you describe reductions?
We do. We actually do both sheltered and unsheltered during our point-in-time count every year. So we do ours annually.
Great. Another question for you. What are common areas you provide training on to local agencies, and what has been needed?
So we're gearing up because one of the things that we feel like we need to go revisit is a training about low barrier shelters, but we really look at the trends or what agencies' needs are. So there was a time where agencies were saying, we really aren't sure how to rapidly rehouse folks with no money. And so we talked a lot about, we spent a lot of time with the National Alliance to help people understand how to help the folks in need regardless of what their income is. Because again, the question is, are they homeless? And then we move forward from there.
Great, thank you. So this question is for Katharine. What do you do when you run out of funds? We have coordinated entry and we almost ran out of rapid rehousing, PSH, and transitional housing.
Well, I mean, the long-term strategy has to be both to increase the funds and to be moving resources out of the less productive parts of your system that may get good outcomes, but they're more expensive for the same kind of outcomes. I mean, hopefully you've seen this before, but rapid rehousing is typically about 1/5 of the cost of transitional housing and also of some fairly deep shelters. It's also really important to see what other resources you can bring into the system. If you're not using TANF resources right now for rapid rehousing, you may want to look into that. You may want to look to other mainstream resources in your community. But yeah, I think you're not alone in finding that the resource is limited, and that the benefit of coordinated entry is it really tells you that. It tells you if you're not right-sized.
Great, thank you. Another question for Katharine. What should be in place if people do not succeed with the progressive engagement approach? What should we do with, for those for whom rapid rehousing is not going to be enough?
So I think if I'm understanding the question, what does it mean to say that we've tried rapid rehousing and it hasn't been successful, now what? So this strategy, and again, many of you said you were doing it, which is great. Maybe the Alliance can do a focus on how communities are doing this, is to really be able to say, we've got a household here that's going to fall out of their housing, and we believe the reason for that is they need a deeper and ongoing subsidy, or they need something that also comes with ongoing long-term support services. And so we're going to have our coordinated entry system prioritize them for an available voucher, an available permanent supportive housing resource, or a longer rental assistance program. Some communities have things that run a little longer than rapid rehousing but aren't lifelong. you'll have to look at your own system's resources to do that, and you have to come up with the test that says this is really failing. You want to be careful that you're not saying, well, they're going to be paying a lot of their income for housing, so it's not working. We know that most families and most individuals who are low income are paying a lot.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for just one more question. We're getting questions, Nichele, this one would be for you, about really gaining support around rapid rehousing. What are some strategies that you use to gain support across the state, and how did you convince community leaders to support rapid rehousing?
So one of the things we did, and again, in the beginning, we really didn't have a whole lot of state data. We used a lot of information from the National Alliance, and we also used outside help, because we wanted people to come in that had seen that it works and talk to folks. I think we would have a different story to tell if it was just the 7 of us walking around saying this probably will work, versus having the National Alliance and other key partners to help us with that messaging. So I think it was just good to have information from places where it did work, and then as we started to have data to show, we were really big on taking out the charts and bringing it around and going wherever we could to show people that this does work and let's continue this. And again, we were fighting the battle of other resources or other people saying this doesn't work. So we were kind of butting our heads, but we wouldn't give up. And again, we felt so strongly that if people were getting housed, it was worth it.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running quickly out of time, so I will skip on to the next slide. I just want to thank Katharine and Nichele for their wonderful presentations, and to direct people to some resources that we have on our website that can really help with if you're interested in learning more about the core components of rapid rehousing or specific information. Our website is endhomelessness.org. We have a regular webinar series, and we also have webinars that dive more deeply into the core components. And you can also find the performance benchmarks and program standards on the website as well. And finally, I'd like to put in a plug for our next webinar, which is taking place next Tuesday at 1 p.m. We'll be talking about rapidly rehousing households with zero income. Again, you can register on our website, and we will be sending out the slides and the audio from the webinar immediately following the event. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating, and hopefully we'll have you on the next webinar as well. And thanks to Nichele and Katharine. All right.